Whether you're using birds on treadmills to generate electricity or you're building an Alliance deck in KeyForge, you're going to need some J-Power. This is the KPR interview with Jason, aka J-Power, the KeyForge player currently holding the shiniest Alliance competitive resume. Let's get sweaty.
Welcome to KeyForge Public Radio with your host, Zach Armstrong.
Welcome, dear listener. I am so happy that you have shown up here for this episode where we're going to talk about the Alliance format in KeyForge. Now, you might know what Alliance is. Maybe that is drumming up a lot of emotion in you, maybe excitement, maybe terror, maybe anger. But here's the thing. It's an official format. I've played it, I've tested it, and it's here to stay. And because we're trying to create a more informed KeyForge player, and that's you, we're going to talk about Alliance and what it takes. If you're unfamiliar with what Alliance is, the way Ghost Galaxy has put this together is that a KeyForge Alliance deck is one deck consisting of 3 house pods recruited from your collection of regular KeyForge decks. The 3 pods in the Alliance deck may be recruited from up to 3 different Archon decks, and each house pod must be from a different house, of course. You can't have a duplicate house, and all the recruited pods must be from the same KeyForge set. So everything has to be from Mass Mutation or Call of the Archons, all the same set. And so the house pod is, you probably understand intuitively, it's well named, is the set of 12 cards dedicated to one house in a single Archon deck. So, a regular KeyForge Archon deck is, how it's printed on the deck list, and it's got 3 different pods of 3 different houses. Alliance decks are also subjected to the restricted list, which is a list of cards maintained by Ghost Galaxy. And if an Alliance deck includes a card listed on the restricted list, that deck cannot contain any other cards on that restricted list. So basically, you get one card from that list, perhaps in multiples if that's allowed by the list, but then you can't include any other cards on that list. So this ends up, of course, it still feels like KeyForge. It still very much is KeyForge. But here's the thing. You're going to have to deck build. You're going to have to select pods, put it together, and think about your game plan, and then compete in a game that might have a slightly different feel than your Archon decks, because these are going to be more tuned. You're going to have a game plan going in. And in November of 2020, there was KeyForge Celebration. You might be familiar with this, where Ghost Galaxy held a number of different tournaments as kind of the final big testing ground for a number of things, and that included Alliance. And our guest today is Jason. He goes by J-Power online. You may have seen him. And Jason built 2 Alliance decks. And here's the thing. Both of those decks ended up in the finals, one piloted by him and another by a friend of his. So kind of an automatic W at the end of the day if you and you and a friend are staring each other down in the finals with decks that you both made, right? So as we approach the 2023 competitive season, an Alliance is on the docket. It's brand new. There's nobody better. There's nobody with a better resume, really, to equip you and me, really, with the foundations of Alliance than Jason. So, Jason, thank you so much for coming on KeyForge Public Radio. I appreciate you coming.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. And we, some listeners who perhaps if they got into KeyForge after the initial competitive seasons back in the day, we actually got the chance to hang out in person a couple of times at a few of those Vault Tours. And I think the Grand Championships in Arlington, Virginia.
Those are the ones we got to see each other. And those were fantastic events, the sealed events for one of them.
Mm-hmm.
Really good.
Yeah, lots of sealed. I kind of lamented I always wanted to do better at those until I looked and I realized I played sealed Age of Ascension for the vast majority of all the competitive events I was able to make it to. So
That's a little tough.
Yeah, especially when it's sealed Triad. Anyways, that's to bed. Alliance is what's here. And you showed up at KFC, Jason, with 2 Alliance decks you had made. You handed one to Jared, who piloted it to the finals to face you, of all people. And so the place, we're going to start at the beginning. So, Jason, when you sit down to build an Alliance deck for competition, where do you start?
Right. So I think what I typically do is try to come up with a deck concept, something that you can kind of see form in Archon. You'll usually see top Archon decks have some sort of strategy associated with them, but you start to think about easiest ways, the most approachable ways, how can you take that strategy and make it more effective? So, what tools do you have between pods and synergies can you build that a normal distribution of Archon printed decks you wouldn't see? But in the aggregate between all the pods, what can you find? So, you kind of look at your collection. That's what I had to do for KFC and decide which things can I really push the power level and limits to with things that we already know exist. Of course, if you get really creative, you can look at things that people have never thought that could exist, and that gets to be its own exercise. But I think for the most approachable exercise for a new player in the format is look at your decks and think of how could they synergize between the various pods.
Yeah. So, looking at trying to figure out a deck concept or a deck game plan, what are some examples of a deck game plan that somebody could build around? Maybe some of the more common ones that might be easier to find in a collection.
Yeah, so I think that probably the most approachable type of deck that you could build is sort of one that generates a lot of amber very quickly, and
Mm,
you look for just a lot of raw pips on your cards and things that can sort of synergize to get more amber boost. That's the ones where you can kind of find those old Coda decks where you'd be
mm,
running a bunch of dust pixies or that type of thing where you get a lot of amber gen very quickly, or you look for some sort of synergies maybe out of say mass mutations where play a lot of mutants and you throw down a Vault's Blessing. You can look for things that there's just a lot of common cards that generate amber. That's a very approachable type of archetype. It's not necessarily one that will get to the day two or the top cut, but you'll
mm.
always have a pretty consistently strong performance and a pretty executable game plan while usually having something available in your collection that can sort of support that for most people.
Yeah. Yeah. And the decks you built for KeyForge Celebration, there was a Call of the Archons deck that Jared piloted that had Battle Fleet, where you reveal Mars cards from your hand to draw Mars cards, so this can build on each other. It had the I was looking at the disc pod earlier. I think it was three Control the Weeks, two
For
Hysterias. Excuse me, four Control the Weeks, two Hysterias, and I think three Ember Imps.
that was an unusual pod to play with. Yeah, so that deck archetype was leaning, of course, into a bit of a combo, but the inspiration for that deck sort of came from two, maybe in people who've been in the game for a long time, two deck concepts that should be somewhat familiar to them, which
Yeah.
are if you saw the battle fleets, you might have heard of the Linguini deck, which was like a three key abduction or two key abduction, three battle fleet deck that was known to just be able to burst and cheat keys. So I've had a pod not as good as that, but something similar that I thought was functionally workable. And then also one of the other early concepts in Call of the Archons was they were called lands decks, library access with phase
Hmm.
shifts and nepenthe seeds in order to be able to cycle your deck and sort of execute a one turn kill. In this case, this deck didn't rely on Nepenthe Seeds, but it did have the library access and it did work with phase shifts, but it worked with battle fleets, which would have been something that a deck statistically would have never had the opportunity to match up with.
Yeah.
And that old lands deck did get library access nerfed in that you couldn't play multiple copies, it would go to purge. So I recognize that those two elements worked extremely well, and as Zach, you pointed out, the control the weaks, the Ember Imps acted as a sort of proxy for no Amber control and worked
Mm.
purely just for the control element, which worked very well because the pod that I worked with for logos had three wild wormholes. So oftentimes in a giant loop, you could end up playing a wild wormhole into a control the weak or an Ember Imp or some form of control mechanism
Yeah.
near power spiking. So it was very much designed to lean into some archetypes that had already existed, but underline the power level of what was possible.
Yeah. Yeah. The that archetype of the library access, which most listeners you probably are familiar with this, especially if you're coming back to KeyForge. But after it sets you up for the rest of the turn. After you play another card, you get to draw a card. And with that deck, that is one where I have a moderately sized collection. For context listeners, I have about 570 decks, and I have a number of library access double phase shift decks. I have a number of double Nepenthe seed pods, with Hunting Witch, Key Charge, Chota, Regrowth, and then other things that support that as well. So I think that is one that if you have a handful of decks, or you're going to hunt on the secondary market for perhaps a cheaper deck that has one of these really good pods, and then two other houses that make the deck perhaps unattractive to Archon play, that is one you can certainly try, and it does feel good to pull off in testing, right? If you just enjoy comboing off.
It is, and I think that one, because almost all of the cards, not in the Mars house, but on the other ones, are commons. It's easy to get duplicates, and because there were
Mm,
over a million scanned,
right.
called Archons decks, there are a lot
Yep.
of things available that are workable tools. The Arc. Now that being said, they did, of course, restrict your ability, as you mentioned, Zach, to be able to use a library access with a control of the weak.
Oh,
But
that's
there are
right.
archetypes around that make sense and are worth exploring and are approachable, in my opinion.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. What Jason was referencing there is the restricted list. Now it has both library access and control the weak on it, and so if you're including control the weak or you're including library access, you can't include the other one now. Um, and as far as other archetypes go, what tell us about the archetype that the other deck you brought to Keyforge Celebration? It was a mass mutation deck with Dis, Logos, and Star Alliance. Tell us about the an archetype that fits into.
Sure. So that one was not completely unique in the tournament, but very rare in that tournament. However, that one I leaned into a pod that I had on Star Alliance. It was from a deck that the community, longer term community, might be familiar with, which we call Sad Panda. What that was, that pod was a somewhat of a combo deck with a transporter platform, which allows me to bring a minion back from the board as an artifact, so as an action. With Nell, who, when you play upgrades, he will help you draw cards with a number of upgrades with, in this case, enhancements on them.
Right.
So it allows you to draw quite a few cards. This would be a perfect example of what I had said before, which was that's an Archon deck, has done well in Archon events. And so I wanted that specific pod with other pods that would make that more consistently executable. And so my other houses I chose to go with, again, you probably see my design preference was Dis, because I had marks of Dis, and furnaces, sort of standard items, but control items in that package. A jar to block against, which actually was relevant in the finals, to block cards like Battlefleet or Control the Weak, or things that, if you stack them, become very disproportionately powerful. So it was a strong shield that came with the deck, along with the efficiency engine, I'll call it, of Starlines, and then a high quality logos house that had autoencoder, had a little bit of a Chronos, and also had significant number of draw pips in house printed. So it had scaling amber control. It was a fairly robust and complete deck. It didn't have it didn't have artifact control in it, but it did have a jar which could block significant other artifacts. The way it functioned was to be fairly efficient. Had a high efficiency rating. So I would say that archetype, as I've worked on it a lot since that event, uh, largely revolves around the creation of efficiency and high card quality. That one is a more challenging archetype to execute and build on. And there are variations of it that I've discovered over the last 8 months or so. But that was what I used to. That was the winning deck for the KFC event.
Yeah. Yeah. And listener, forgive me if you don't know all the cards we're saying as we go through Alliance. This would triple the length of the episode to explain each of them. But one card I've heard talked about, both because it was in Jason's deck, listener, and elsewhere, is Eatons Jar, which is only in mass mutation. It's a rare, it's an artifact. It has a playability that says name a card until Eaton's Jar leaves play. Cards with that name cannot be played. And so, one just very specific question for you, Jason. Um, this this is one of those cards that more gets better, in Alliance. Is that correct?
That is definitely accurate. That is an extraordinarily powerful card in this format. And
Yeah.
and I had been lucky because when Mass Mutations first came out, I had a particular affinity for that. So all
Mm,
my top tier competitive Mass Mutations decks included a jar in them.
yeah.
So
That
I had
makes sense.
good choices to work from for that.
In if somebody wants to make a top cut out of Vault Tour in Alliance, do you think they need to have Jar or a plan or a response to Jar, or at least a approach? I mean, they'll need a plan for seeing Jar, I assume. But do you think people need to pack specific responses like purging it or something else?
It will totally depend on the uh, deck that you're deciding to show up with. I don't think
Yeah.
that the meta is so well defined that you need to come with a specific response to a specific card in all instances.
Yeah.
A little bit maybe, but for I suspect there will be more Martian Generosity key abduction decks because there are probably over 1,000 pods that have both of those cards in them, and they act as a fairly good tool from AOA.
Yeah.
However, my experience, and I've built quite a few um, Alliance builds. Every set has viable archetypes to try to get to a top 8 cut of an Alliance format, from my perspective. There are different sets have different number of viable archetypes to be
Sure.
sure, and different archetypes have different availability also to be sure. Some are extraordinarily rare to be able to build as an archetype. Some are fairly common, like I just point out Martian Generosity, Key Abduction. So I think what I would tend to speak to on that, to your question, is generally I would work on my deck design if I were to be in the secondary market procuring decks
Mm,
for things that make my deck work better first
yeah.
to create
Sure.
better consistency and performance for my deck. I think it's a design consideration if you can have sort of an embarrassment of riches and be able to swap specific cards for meta purposes. But generally speaking, you really want to synergize in however your deck wants to behave. That's going to be your higher priority. And usually, if you do that, you'll get a higher overall win rate and a better, more success out of your deck, and probably also have a more reasonable time procuring the pods you're looking for.
Yeah. That makes sense. So it's your what I'm hearing is that you're putting together an alliance deck, you're kind of starting from scratch, looking at your collection. You get a concept, perhaps just one you enjoy or one inspired by. You have at least one really good pod there. So, is the recommendation then to focus on your concept and the game plan, and focus on that first, and then worry about any kind of tools or responses later?
Yeah. So, um, to my experience, and
Yeah,
probably outside the statistical norm for alliance players, since I'm trying to build maybe 8 to 12 archetypes concurrent to one another. So
sure.
if I have all the pods, it's very easy, right? And if you have 1 or 2 pods, it can be challenged to fill out your second or third pod. Building an idea from scratch and having no viable pods
Mm,
is extraordinarily challenging. I can tell you, I've
right,
been working on some of my archetypes for 8 months and have yet to complete them. I might have 2 out of 3 pods at a level that makes me satisfied, but it is a
right.
very
Wow.
challenging thing to do. So for most people, my suggestion is if you have one pod that you truly think is special, work from that pod. If you have two that you think work together, you are so much better shape. But
Mm,
the trick to the mentality associated with building a good alliance deck, I think, is very different than what people might on average be used to. And the reason is because as you try and work towards getting 3 pods to perform the way you want them to, in my experience, you're better off getting suboptimal pods to fill out your alliance first, hopefully cheap ones,
sure.
and then iterate and then upgrade your pods. So build your deck. Don't just get 2 out of 3 and then hope and think that you must get the perfect third pod. Get
Mm,
1 or 2 that you really like and find a viable third one. And don't stress too much if it's not the perfect one. What I find is when you play that way, you get more excited about your alliance deck the more you play it, and then
Yeah.
you will dig deeper and try harder to swap out individual pods. So once you've gone back and you've been able to upgrade some of your pods, you start to form a long-term affinity for your deck because you really do start to add pods. And once you've added and even gone back to some of what were your original ones that you built your pods with, what it'll help you do, I think, over time, or what I expect will happen in the long-term form of the meta, is you'll be able to swap some of those pods for things that you might see in in the meta that you might want defenses against, to your point earlier, Zach, on the jar, for example.
Mm.
So you might not start there when you're building it. That's why I say focus on making your deck good the way it should be and synergize well. Get your second or your third pod, and then you can go back and you can try to find new ones over time. That's, I think, the exploratory nature of your alliance deck, which is very different than Archon. So you have to have a different mindset associated with. You can always tweak and improve what your underlying deck could be.
Yeah. Something you said in that kind of process overview, Jason, that I think is really good advice is talking about it being a process and an iterative process, instead of simply, you've tested a little bit, you found one set of three pods, and then like that's it, you're playing Alliance. But instead thinking of it as, well, no, if you have one or two good pods that really sing together, they harmonize with that concept that you want, go ahead and just find something that roughly supports it and play it so you know what you need to fill it in, and then you get an affinity for it and you evolve your thinking and you play different matchups, right? So I think that's really good advice for people who want to explore Alliance, which I hope is plenty of people. And I've been, even though I was skeptical, I have been brainstorming and testing myself, even though I don't think I'll play it at a Philadelphia as of recording is the upcoming Vault Tour. I don't think I'll play Alliance there. But man, it has I've sunk at least for myself at least probably 12 hours into just brewing and then testing and trying some ideas. I tried to break. I'll save this for another time, dear listener. But I tried to break Tesmal in Worlds Collide because I have a legacy Tesmal, and it used scientifical hack. The most. It's not even bad enough to be like be remarkable in some way. it's just it's just the most meh artifact of all time.
Well, it's
But
funny because I think people could look, I think, sometimes at the decks that I've created and they would say those are extremely impressive. But what you don't always see is all the deck archetypes that I thought might be fun to try and then
right.
failed miserably, and what I had to learn from why those don't work, and looking at the taking an approach on the format, it can be very different. And I think one thing I would suggest for most people too is the fixating the cards. Of course, you know your cards. That's important, but you need to think about what the game mechanics you are that exist that you're trying to work with. And I'll suggest to people where I found the most success with archetypes are things that bend the game mechanics the most severely, in a way that sort of is interesting. That's sort of the what people might have saw in my finals match with Jared, where suddenly I was cycling my entire deck. I had all my cards in my deck in my hand
Mm.
multiple turns in a row. How did the game state evolve to get to that point? And when
Yeah.
you're thinking about what you can do, that's not the only consideration, obviously. There's a lot of different ways manipulating your graveyard, manipulating your archive, manipulating your draw pile, manipulating your opponent's hands and draw pile. So there's a lot of ways. So you really want to think in terms of game mechanics and how you want, to your point earlier, Zach, too, again, was what is your game plan? What do you want to try to have fun with in the format? It can be very different.
Yeah. Um, what? So when you sit down and you're testing against other alliance decks, or you're sitting down like at KeyForge Celebration, what does matchup evaluation look like in alliance? Is it does it look different than it does in Archon?
In some ways, it's easier to understand.
Mm.
In some ways, it can be more convoluted. I think when you practice, if you're very good at Archon, um, you know your deck extraordinarily well. What is easy to sometimes overlook in certain cases in Archon would be um, edge case synergies within an Archon deck because you don't see them very often, but because a deck was printed, there's just a little extra sweetener typically in
Yeah.
a deck. In Alliance, there's not as many edge case synergies. Most of the major synergies will jump out at you because somebody threw 3 battle fleets in their deck, or they threw,
That's
you
right.
know, some, something that's like in multiples because they're trying to, like I said, just now break a mechanic or push a mechanic to its edge of design,
Yeah.
and so you can see it. What becomes harder in your deck analysis is to know if your opponent does that or pushes their game plan that way, how broken is this going to feel when it if something breaks loose? If I'm playing against a Jenka deck, exactly how? If there's a helper bot, if there's a nature's call, if there's a Jenka, like what weird things are about to happen to you all at once that you normally not have experienced?
Mm.
And trying to read for a different level of power is more challenging. Um, and exactly when is that going to show up in the game? You know, when people start to, and I especially probably am most guilty of, push on efficiency builds, your sense of the cadence of playthrough is very different. So you might look at somebody's deck and you say, well, there's a jar in there. But if that deck draws its entire deck by turn three almost every game, that jar is going to show up. And it's going to be a relevant card. It is not going to be a
That's right.
turn 8, and maybe it's 15% that it shows up. It's like 100% that it'll show up. So be able to read a deck for what they're capable of is one of the more interesting challenges in in Alliance format.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Yeah, I do think it's generally speaking, I think you're totally right in that when you sit down, you can go, oh yeah, they're packing 4 of this common, right? Or they've packed 3 of this common and then 2 of this uncommon in this other house that does something similar. Okay, I see where the game plan is starting to go. And sometimes, yeah, it's so explosive that you are going to be facing everything in the deck each time
Yeah.
because that consistency is a big factor. And I think people will know this perhaps from board games or card games they've gone. But is and I know you have this is one of your affinities, right? Efficiency,
Mhm.
and especially in KeyForge with extra card draw with archiving. Do you think a deck without efficiency as a part of its concept can compete against a deck with efficiency as a part of its concept? Will that be an uphill battle?
Yeah, so there are viable non-efficiency build archetypes that my team has, I have, that
Mm,
I think are viable. I don't usually always show off all those archetypes, but those archetypes certainly exist.
yeah,
They are um, far more interesting in certain respects because they have to be very mindful of the mix and nature of the cards. They have to play a
yeah,
different type of approach. I would say generally in all cases, even if you're playing with a card like that or a style or archetype like that, you're still going to want to add efficiency if you can find a way to add efficiency. It's just objectively better because, as I like to sort of say,
yes,
efficiency is the way to consistency, right? So,
right. That's
and
right.
I do like consistent performance, and I think anyone who's trying to really push their decks will want to look for that. But there's various ways to achieve that consistency in your decks.
Yeah, I would agree with that recommendation. That and I like how you said it, where perhaps your concept isn't completely centered around efficiency in a particular way, but wherever you can put it in so that you play consistently, so that you can get consistent results with that deck, which is what you want, especially if you're going to go to a vault tour, try to make top 8, and you're trying to win actual cash money at this point,
Mhm.
right?
That's right.
For sure, for sure. One more question. So going a bit off of all these kind of standard recommendations and philosophies for how to put together an alliance deck, how to have an affinity for it over time. So you've practiced a lot of alliance, and are there any like thoughts, recommendations, or changes that you want to put out there into the KeyForge universe? As far as GG's considerations for
Mhm.
alliance moving forward, as far as fine tuning it, are there different philosophies they could apply to it? As somebody who's practiced this a bunch, where have you landed so far in thinking about alliance on that high
Yeah.
kind of level?
So this is I've had some conversations with the folks at GG when I went to KFC, and I think
Yeah.
what we got feedback from a little bit from that event was their revised restricted list. Um, to the kind of key feedback, if you think about it, or one of the things that they said was they're looking for people to show up with things that are very broken. That is
Right.
part of what they want this format to feel like for the players.
Yeah.
And so I'm not at a point yet, and I've played a lot of games. I have played 1,000 plus Alliance
Yeah.
games. I've probably played more than that. I've played a lot of games of Alliance. Where I'm at right now is I think we need to see how the meta develops and
Yep.
allow people and afford people the ability to, as you sort of spoke to, decide how to make that meta evolve. If the meta becomes stagnant over time, then some tweaks are necessary, especially if the decks that win are not replaceable as archetypes. That would be
Mm,
a problem. So I'm
right.
aware of a couple decks that exist, alliance decks that exist that are non-replicatable decks. There simply aren't other lists printed that can replicate what a couple
Mm,
people have been able to do with just a couple decks. And I mean only two. So I mean, like,
yeah.
there's not a long
Sure.
list. But if those two decks won every event, nobody could replicate the archetype. And in one of those cases, I'm not so
Mm,
sure people could really counter the archetype effectively. And I'm not
sure.
saying that that deck is good enough to win, but I'm saying if that were to be the case, then I think they would need to reevaluate some of their approach. But in the meantime, if people show up with uh, archetypes that are approachable, I think that's why they didn't ban Martian Generosity, Key Abduction combo.
Mm,
Fairly commonly available. Two of the top four decks were those.
right.
They did lose to the archetypes that I built, so they were clearly viable compared to the entire rest of the field.
Yeah.
But were they so broken that they could just win an event and it wasn't, and it felt like a terrible play experience for people? Not so much. I think the one thing that they will probably should give consideration over time is what is the play experience for people
Mm,
in the event. So not do you just win? That's
right.
not the metric. How do
Right.
you win? How does it feel to lose in that experience? And I think that may have been in small part some of the consideration for the control the weak restriction with the library access because
Mm,
uh, what Jared was doing oftentimes there would be games where he would control the weak somebody 4 turns in a row and just
oof,
win the game and they were just out, and that creates a very negative
that
uh,
feels bad.
play experience. It was can't argue that it won games. I mean, he went undefeated until
That's
he got
right.
to the finals match. It won against it would be both those Jenka decks that placed top four, or won it earlier in the tournament and won the other one in the top four. It was stronger, but it didn't create a play, the right play experience. And I wouldn't necessarily say Jenka would either, but I think there has to be some consideration to that. But let's see how in my opinion, I would rather see how the first season goes and then tweak after the season to see what people do and how they respond. Because um, right now it's sort of there's a all there really is to work with is an online culture where people are testing some severely edge case decks that are been net
Right.
decked and may not be viable in real play. Let's see what
Right.
people can really show up with and how those decks interact and what the play experience is. So I'm withholding my general feedback
That
for the time being.
honestly, I think that's a great answer because as much as we can, trust people like, Michael Hurley having plenty of development experience, and we've got Luke Olson on there now. I don't, I do think, yeah, like you said, they're going to be iterating, they're going to be learning and seeing what happens. And so, dear listener, if you're planning on playing Alliance and this helps you, like, yeah, it's you've been asked, hey, come break this. Right, come win with a deck that they go, excellent, you're now a Vault Tour champion and we're gonna make changes to the restricted list in your honor.
That's
Or
how
the
Jared
20
felt, anyways.
or the 2024 season, we'll have some adjustments to Alliance because of what showed up in the 2023 season. So yeah, like your process, like a person's process with their Alliance deck, I think I think it's going to be easy to have a lot of fun in Alliance, and I think this is going to be really, shouldn't always give Ghost Galaxy a free pass, but I think where KeyForge was such uncharted territory, and in some places it still is, and now we're in Alliance, which is again uncharted territory. So I think giving some space for some iterating, for some learning, some figuring out what those play experiences should be is a good thing. Is a good
Yeah,
thing.
I would. Yeah, I would kind of build on his head, encourage people not to chicken little when they see a deck or have a play experience that it feels ridiculous. I think if you come to it with the right, obviously people are trying, they're paying money to be at these vault tours, so I understand the investment
Mm,
involved,
yeah.
but also have a little bit of, you know, awe when somebody does something that is ridiculous, because I think in doing so it'll incentivize people to dream big. And I can say, even though I know I've been working on these archetypes for a lot of hours, a lot of time here, there are a lot of unexplored, and I can guarantee you viable archetypes I have not yet touched, and I know other people have not yet touched either. So there's a lot of
Mm,
open space. So the initial reaction shouldn't be, I didn't like that play experience. It should be, how could I dream up something that could be competitive with that, and start
sure.
to use that creativity, which I think is for a certain type of player is a joyful experience. Not for everybody, but for people who might find that fun, it can be a lot of fun.
Yep. That's great. Well, Jason, thank you so much for coming on today. It's been a pleasure having you. And dear listener, I hope you feel encouraged and equipped to be trying to do some alliance brews yourself. And here's your goal, dear listener: is if you go to a vault tour and you're playing against my guest Jason here, I want you to have built a deck so degenerate that Jason has to go, wait, no, this isn't a negative play experience. I'm having awe.
Great.
That's right. And Jason, I understand that Nova, who is the person behind Decks of KeyForge, launched a couple new features to support Alliance. Could you go over what those are? What those features are on dexofkeyforge.com?
Yeah, I think there's a couple items that have been very helpful that have been pulled together here, specifically for your deck building. So now you can go and look at not just the decks that you're creating, but you can also look at other decks that other people have pulled together. And I think while there's quite a bit of noise there, there's also quite a bit of interesting deck ideas. So you can use that as a form of some inspiration if you're looking for a place to start on what the art of the possible could be for decks, and maybe what you could do with that. And then the other thing that I've seen, which I think is also fantastic, is after the Master Bolt had opened up where pips fell, you can now see
Mm,
those on each individual deck on decks of Keyforge, which is also, I will give a hint to everybody, extremely helpful if you're trying to
yes.
build edge case decks and you want an inordinate number of pips in a pod that you might be playing for
Right.
this format. So I would use those tools to see what you can dream up.
Awesome. Well, again, Jason, thank you so much. And yeah, we'll see you around the circuit this fall.
I look forward to it. Take care. Thank you, Zach.
A special thanks to our Patreon supporters at the Airwave Advocate level. Currently, that's Paul Roadrunner. Thank you, Paul Roadrunner, and all of our other Patreon supporters for your support of KeyForge Public Radio. It shows that you believe in KeyForge and you help us keep going. And dear listener, just like your radio dial, may your KeyForge skills be well tuned. KeyForge Public Radio is produced by Rooster High Productions, which is me. If you have any questions about how a podcast produced by me could serve your business, organization, or expertise, send me an email at zach@roosterhigh.com. To support KPR in our mission to provide the community with resources and raise the profile of this amazing game, join the Patreon, where you will vote on what content is next, discuss the show and share ideas, and receive discounts in the merch store. Speaking of the merch store, what better way to show off your love of KeyForge and this show by buying a KPR hat, shirt, or even a pair of sandals? On our website, keyforgepublicradio.com, you can read show notes, blog posts, and more, so give that a visit. Stay engaged with the show by following us on any social media platforms you frequent. Just search for KeyForge Public Radio. And remember, dear listener, the most important part of KeyForge is the person across the table.